Hi there, and welcome to What Are You Thinking About? A show where we ask the question, and that sort of dictates our conversation. My name is Adam Freedom, Melbourne comic, filmmaker, musician, and writer. Follow me at AdamFreedom_ on Instagram and Twitter. Subscribe to my YouTube, Adam Freedom, like my Facebook page, and hopefully share this podcast around with your friends and family when it comes out. We try to have pretty interesting and intriguing conversations. My first guest ever for the podcast is Kimberly Westenhiser. She is a freelance writer, photographer, and illustrator living in Washington. She's been featured in the Seattle Globalist, War is Boring, and CoffeeOrDie.com. Her photography has also been in Foreign Policy and Playboy, which is pretty nuts. Being in Playboy, that was probably a cool feling. You're like, yeah. Hugh Hefner died, and then you're like, yeah, I still got my photography in these magazines.
Yeah. We just published an article on their website about a Lebanese pop star and the sort of the relationship between sexual freedoms and expression and also talking about the revolution. And I'm really proud of it.
Yeah, that's awesome. Apparently, the Playboy articles in the past were not as great, but nowadays, since I think they censored a lot of, they Playboy models don't get nude now, so I guess they sort of had to bump up the quality of their articles, which is a good thing. I think that's a positive step in the right direction.
Yeah, they always kind of do pretty interesting stuff. My colleague did an article about the bar scene in Erbil, which is the capital of Iraqi Kurdistan. So
that's interesting because we sort of met through a funny way, on this live stream, and then we were talking about films. And then it sort of came back to, you're like, yeah, I'm a freelance writer. I sort of focus on Northeast Syria. Here's some articles I've done. And I read the articles and they were really amazing. And she had this great photography. So I thought, perfect guest for the first episode. Conflict journalists are super interesting. Even we've chatted before about the psychology of conflict journalists and even journalists in general. They sort of do their work and their process and the sort of ins and outs. But as the title of the podcast says, we can go anywhere with this. It's open dialogue, sort of Hegelian in a sense, maybe not really. But yeah, let's give it a go. So Kimberly, what are you thinking about?
Well, I mean, that's always a tricky question for me because I'm someone who is not only constantly thinking, but constantly thinking on multiple levels. So it's kind of I'm thinking about many things at once, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I've got definitely the same thing. I've tried to describe to people, when I describe anxiety, I don't know, the first thing we're going to learn, folks, in this podcast is anxiety and depression plague my life. But that's not a pity plea or anything like that. But with my anxiety, I've tried to explain anxiety to people. And it's like holding 10 thoughts at once almost. And people, when I say that to people, they're like, whoa, that must be a fuck ton. Because, neurotypical people normally have 3 or 4 thoughts at once, maybe. Mm-hmm. There's the conscious thought, I'm walking down the street. Then there's did I leave the oven on? And then there's the thought in the past, and then maybe the dream in the future. There's those sort of 4 layers of basic conscious reality. But I feel with people anxiety or really deep thinkers, it's 10 or even 20 thoughts at once. It can just go constantly. It's almost constantly a galloping drum. You're just constantly thinking about something else. But I wanted to ask you, because I've never heard someone explain it on, I guess, levels. So What do you mean about having thoughts on different levels?
So it's like, well, I mean, it's almost exactly like the way that you described it. So where my head is right now, so I'm like thinking about the things that I did today, right? So I did some weeding and then, just like the chores that I did, and then thinking about like my sort of like emotional landscape and what that's doing, and also like how that relates to, my goals. My goals relate to the state of the world. That like state of the world thought kind of leads into like the sort of condition of humanity. Like today I was thinking a lot about racism. So it goes from like these like very small, sort of infinitesimal, like not even significant things. Like I accidentally punched a rose bush pulling out a weed. and, and then it just kind of like spirals into these like grand meta narratives, sort of wrestling with these things, like these huge colossal issues that really bother me, but I don't have like no control over.
So it sort of just like spirals out. It starts from like a micro level thought, like, oh, I cut myself on a rose bush, and then you start thinking about like, making a progressive logical leap. So let's say you cut yourself on a rose bush, and then you start thinking about blood, and then you start thinking about poppies or something like that. Or maybe you go from blood to being like, oh my god, everyone's got blood inside of them, and then like, oh my god, how many people are suffering now, and then
Yeah.
oh shit, the world is a fucking mess, like it's sort of like stepping stones or something like that.
Yeah.
Where I was going with the poppies was like, you could think about, so if you cut yourself on a rose bush and then you start thinking about poppies, because in Australia we've got this thing called the Anzacs, which is the Australian New Zealand Army Corps. And basically during Gallipoli, what was it? There were these poppies, and apparently the blood of the soldiers like went on the poppies. So that's what I think about. And then from there, I would probably start thinking about war. And then why do we have war? How many wars are going on? Oh my god, there's so many people in war. Holy fuck. How do I stop a war? Can I even stop a war? I guess with those two examples, we're like, yeah, it sort of ascends in a crazy way. And
Yeah.
how do you think, does that ever turn off for you, or have you always struggled with that?
No, it never turns off. And like I was talking to one of my friends about it, and we were like drinking together, and he just looked at me and he was like, "You just never stop thinking, do you?" Like this was like a foreign concept to him, and I'll have those moments sometimes where I realize that people, like other people's brains just work in a way that is like completely unfathomable to me, because like I can't imagine like not thinking all the time. And he told me, he's like, I can just like not think for like an hour and stare off into space. And I'm like, I don't understand that. I've never been that way.
Yeah, exactly. Like without any other substances, like just being completely sober, it's hard to stop.
Well, even when I'm intoxicated, like I'm still like going, still spinning all the time. That's like, you and I have talked about this, but that's like a pretty common thing with journalists, and kind of like what makes good journalists good is that we just, because we're always going, like we always want to be on top of the news because it like gives us anxiety and we have to like do something about it. Almost all every journalist I've ever met has some variety of anxiety disorder and is also an alcoholic. So
Yeah, and it sort of makes sense, doesn't it? In the sense of like people, so let's say people that are overthinkers, like they're really deep thinkers. So how do they fix a problem? By thinking even more deeply, using those thoughts and writing them down, and also having to pay attention to everything else. It sort of makes sense that someone who overthinks would want to think even more about what's going on in the world and then try to express that to other people. And the alcoholic part makes sense because I feel like journalists are like those Facebook moderators you hear about that are just like constantly looking at the worst, most like depressing, vile shit, and like just, I think, always being blocked by injustice and feeling like you can't really do anything. You're always stuck at that sort of wall. and it sort of numbs you out when you're just reading article after article after article. And it makes sense. I would feel like you would have to numb that sort of
Yeah.
pain in a way.
Yeah. I mean, it's not just that. It's just also like because we're like constantly going, like our brains are constantly going, that in and of itself is stressful, even if we're not dealing with like secondhand trauma or reading about horrible things. Just because like we're constantly thinking and like it's like an engine that's constantly operating. Like the alcohol is just kind
Yeah,
of like
right.
a way to like get it to like chill out. I don't want to like speak for anybody else, but and I'm also not saying that I'm an alcoholic, but it's been like a reoccurring theme I've noticed.
And then it's sort of when the next sort of evolution of that from a journalist to a, let's say, a conflict journalist or a war journalist, that they sort of get out of that headspace, or to get out of that space of feeling like confined at the office, writing article after article about places you've never been and people you've never met.
I mean, I wouldn't say that it's like a sense of confinement necessarily. It's more so just like open source intel is like a really valid way of collecting information and like writing about things. And I know people who are like extremely good at it and have turned out some excellent news as a result of that. But when you show up in a location, sometimes you're gonna find things that you didn't think that you were gonna find just based off of like what you were aggregating off of Twitter. So it's like it's really just it's a matter of getting the pulse on what's actually happening there. Like it because it was like I knew what was going on in northeast Syria and like Rojava before, just based off of reading and research, but I didn't know what it felt like to be there, if that makes sense. And there were things that I was like exposed to that were like it basically just like put it into perspective, and I was able to sort of make meaningful connections with my sources because I was there in person, essentially.
Well, I was almost talking about like the evolution one step further for a journalist is that sort of conflict journalist, and going to, as you said, the source of the event, actually being there. And that would terrify so many people. Being in a dangerous situation, anything could happen, like those scenes in those movies where the journalists are there and there's like a conflict behind them, or the aliens are coming or whatever the fuck, and then like the camera turns off and then like, oh shit, the journalist is dead. But yeah, how do you overcome that fear, or what sort of lures you to places like that? You're almost like confronting those really scary ideas, because when people hear about Syria, when people hear about ISIS, they sort of turn their brains off and they're like, oh, that's happening in a place that I don't know about, far, far, far away from me, and I'm safe or whatever. But you're directly confronting that. How do you sort of manage that, but also why do you do it?
So like in terms of, I guess, dealing with the fear, you just don't think about it. And it's really like the fear comes afterward, and for me it kind of came like months after, like when I started to really kind of reckon with what I was doing and like why I was doing it. But yeah, you just like if you're going into that kind of environment, you're basically just focused on what you're doing and getting the work done, because if you're
Right.
scared, then you're going to make a mistake, and if you make a mistake, then that could get you killed or kidnapped or hurt. You just don't think about it, and you just go and you do the thing, and then deal with all of the emotional bullshit that comes with it later when you get home and you're secure. But in terms of like why I do it, like growing up during the Iraq War, I remember watching it on the news with my dad, and like that being so sort of present in the zeitgeist was very formative for me. Like the way that I sort of came to understand the greater world essentially was through the lens of that war. And that also kind of like instilled like a lot of shame in me as an American, because like in my household we did not support the war. And yeah, and I still think it was a horrible fucking decision, and a lot of horrible things came out of it, and it was something that we really botched. Coming from that angle and like, going to Iraq specifically was really kind of important for me because I wanted it to be like I wanted Iraq to be something that was like a tangible concept, if that makes any sense. Like it wasn't just something that sort of like existed in an idea. It was like out in the
Mm.
ether. I wanted it to be like real, and I wanted the Iraqi people to be like real, and I wanted to interact with them.
Yeah, and there's sort of that idea of that realness, almost what I was touching on before, becoming a war journalist. I wouldn't say it's masochistic, but almost like there's got to be something more intense. There is a numbness to journalism in the sense of like article after article, the 24-hour news cycle. There is that numbness, another mass shooting. Oh, I feel numb. Another whatever blowout in politics or another Donald Trump bad tweet. I feel numb. But when you're actually in a war conflict zone, and you could probably attest for this, it's real, and it's probably intense, and those feelings are there and they're valid and they're not distant. So I completely get what you're saying. And I think it's also interesting that your household was against the war, because normally a lot of journalists I've found are very like counter to their family. They're sort of rebellious. They're like, yeah, I'm going to do a journalism degree. I'm going to show all these, conservative ass hats that I'm so intelligent and this, that, the other. But it's interesting that your household was against the war. And did you grow up in a very progressive household as well?
I wouldn't say it was progressive necessarily. My dad he was pretty opinionated about some things in particular, and I think the war was one of them, although I don't think it was for the right reasons necessarily, because I think that he was still kind of coming from like a
Yeah.
very Anglo-centric colonial mindset as like a white American. And like he was also a baby boomer because like my parents had me pretty late. He definitely had like a boomer mentality, and that was definitely there was a lot of friction between us because of
Mm,
that. But like um he was actually fairly conservative, and I was like extremely progressive coming up like into adulthood. He was like against the war, but it wasn't for like liberal
mm.
progressive
See, and that's
reasons.
interesting. See, I would have assumed they were definitely for liberal reasons, but there is sort of the conservative argument against the war. It's like, yeah, it's not our war. It doesn't matter. We should be focusing on ourselves. That sort of isolationist policy sort of
Yeah,
stuff.
yeah.
So, what you were thinking about today? You said you were thinking about racism today. Um, what sort of thoughts did you have about that?
So I just read Heavy by Kisa Layman. I feel
Mm,
sort of not at all like I have like no sort of authority on this topic. Like it's not this is more just like these are like sort of my personal thoughts on it, like my relationship to it. I don't feel like it's something that I can like write about professionally, but yeah, so that book had a really kind of profound impact on me, not only because he's a great writer and like the way that he writes has like such a tremendous pulse to it. What I've always like thought about like my metric for measuring a good writer is like how concisely can you like put an idea into words? How few words can you use in order to like convey a very like precise feeling, like something that is very like idiosyncratic to a particular situation or person. And he's like extremely good at that. Like the way that he just kind of puts things together, it's like exactly what he means, but it's not even like in the words themselves, it's the whole construction of it, if that makes any sense. That was really verbose, but this book that he wrote was really it's pretty like autobiographical and like to his mother, and he was talking about the impact of being like growing up as a black man in I think he's from Mississippi, um so like deep south. And I was thinking about how there are when you're someone that grows up in that kind of environment, it's like you're kind of constantly walking around underneath this pressure because of like the way that you were born and because of these, circumstances in society. So there's this like huge, massive problem that you're constantly wrestling with that you don't have control over, basically. So I was thinking about that, and then I was also thinking about like how there are people who have never like had to deal with that. Like they've never had to rail against circumstances that are essentially not their fault. It still impacts them in every like possible conceivable way, and they're thinking about it all the time, and they don't have to walk around with this like pressure essentially.
Yeah, there is an underlying tension, and especially for children that are minority backgrounds, they could probably sense a tension, but they don't even know what it is. And like I remember as a kid, I'm half Tunisian and half Greek. And I remember there was sort of a tension when I would either go to, like, for example, I used to go to Arabic school.
Mm-hmm.
My dad used to force us to go to, it's like Sunday school, but for Muslims. And there was a tension because I was half Greek and I looked a bit whiter than the other kids. But I didn't know what that tension was. You know what I mean? And on the other flip side, the Greek community, like when I did tell them I was Arab or had an Arab background, they were very like questioning, but I never understood why they were questioning. So there is that always that underlying tension that you may not even understand. And then when you reach a certain age, maybe, coming of age, you sort of look back on memories of moments like that. And you're like, wow, that person was actually like being racist, or, oh yeah, that person was actually like judging me for that. So yeah, definitely. It underlines every sort of thing you do. I'm not saying to an extreme, like for me, I was pretty lucky when it comes to that. And I definitely have a lot of privilege to being harassed or being judged or being questioned or being ostracized. But I can definitely sort of relate to that underlying feeling that you're talking about. And what do you think sort of creates that ethos or that underlying tension? Like, what do you think?
Well, I think it's, the constant sense of othering, of being othered all the time. I think feeling as if, you are not being provided certain things because of, this reason that you don't have control over. But I mean, in my mind, it's such a huge, like colossal sort of amorphous thing. It's difficult to pinpoint it at any like one specific juncture because it is so like all encompassing for some people and so like deeply ingrained in like America in particular and Australia too, it would seem. It's just, I don't know, it's really like bonkers to me. Like the area that I live in is like really, really, really white, and there's a lot of like white affluent people here, and like the way that they behave sometimes, where there's just like, like you just know that they haven't known any like real difficulty or like real hardship before. It's kind of vexing to deal with like their attitude on par of that and like the things that they get upset about. It's like, yeah, it's this area is like kind of lauded as being like, really liberal and progressive, but then like because it's sort of like paradise, right? Because I live on an island. Like paradise does not sort of build any character or like real understanding of the world, and like the people here are like really sheltered, and they kind of like get conservative in their own sort of strange way, if that makes any sense, despite being very like politically left.
Right. Yeah, that's almost like the idea of the bubble, and like if you're outside of the bubble, then you're different and you're other. And they've sort of created that space out of trying to embrace the other, but now being against the other. That's really funny that that you've noticed that, especially on like a little island, because or everyone would probably be saying, yeah, we accept everyone, we're so progressive, and then the next thing you know, they've never talked to someone outside of their race, or they've never they don't leave the island. And it's sort of that idea of how can you create real change without stepping outside yourself. You can't just be so introspective for the rest of your life. Even though you might have the right idea, you have to act on that idea, I feel.
Yeah, and I feel like you need to in order
So
for you to have like real growth and development and sort of get new ideas and a broader understanding, you need to be uncomfortable. Like you need to feel discomfort in order to develop as a person. This place is like nothing but comfort. Like I have a friend that's like afraid of homeless people, and he grew up here. It's like, what are you? Oh my God.
yeah, it's almost like they don't see them as human. That's really fucked. Yeah, but I definitely agree with that statement about always being uncomfortable. And I was having a chat about this with someone yesterday. Complacency is such a comfortable thing. It's so easy to be like, yeah, I'm in my house, everything's paid for, I'm warm, I have a nice job, I have a nice cushy job, and I get to watch Netflix. And it's alluring because it's so simple and easy to do. But to actually create change and action and growth in yourself, you sort of have to be masochistic in a sense, always jumping into something that's really uncomfortable.
Yeah, I don't know if I would call it masochism. I personally don't feel like I'm masochistic. I'm trying to get away from pain because I feel like the only way that I can sort of kind of overcome it or deal with it is by going through it. So I kind of have to like deal with that discomfort and that pain head on. Otherwise, it's just gonna like come back around and like be worse later.
As I was saying with complacency has a price, and that price is sort of that you lose all that meaning. It dries up so quickly.
Mhm.
If I wasn't like reading and doing things and being creative in isolation, I feel like if I was just watching Netflix every day and just waking up and sleeping, waking up, I would lose my mind. You know what I mean? And I feel like from that micro level, going back to the macro level, I feel like in society, so many people do that. And they do lose their minds, but they don't really know how to pull themselves out of it. And it's
Yeah.
sort of, and I like your point about what you said. It's not masochistic, but it's sort of getting away from pain. It's sort of anti-masochistic because you're getting away
Mhm.
from that existential dread that is really painful. I don't know, we don't teach a lot of people to do that, or we don't even think about that.
I think in Western society in particular, we've kind of like torn apart like wisdom traditions. And I think that those were really in the past responsible for facilitating, that level of thinking and like sort of engaging with the more thorny and difficult aspects of the human condition. But as we've sort of embraced science and empiricism more, we've gotten away from that. And so we're kind of left in this weird spot emotionally where we don't know how to handle these situations that empiricism does not encompass. Because we can't use empirical tools to sort of solve these problems.
Like, you could be the most effective human being. You could wake up early, you could be a minimalist, you go to the gym, you have a good income, you don't smoke, you don't drink, do any drugs, and you just live your whole life like that in that routine for years and years and years, and you just see all the time pass. That doesn't mean that you're an effective human being. It's almost anti-effective human being. As like, you're doing all the right things. Of course you're doing all the right things, but you're not happy. And I remember this concept I was talking to someone about once. It's like the difference between survival and thriving. Because we've figured out survival in Western societies and very privileged areas. We've figured out survival. Survival is the 9-to-5 job. Survival is the food on the plate, roof over your head. Someone will always sort of help. Not in America's case, but in Australia, someone will always help you. If you fuck up so badly, someone's going to help you. So we've sort of figured out survival, and now it's about thriving, sort of becoming more than survival. And how do we create an environment where we can do more than survival? It's really difficult and hard for people to figure out, because it's something we haven't experienced before, and it's almost like a very new concept, because survival was much harder back in the day. You had to walk a kilometer to get water, or you had to chop wood to have fire, and since that's all taken out of the equation, it's sort of, we're left with like, okay, what the fuck do we do now?
You're not being like how Heidegger talked about this like Dasein. There's no real sense of being in that sort of mode of operation where you're just kind of like meeting the demands of like, society and capitalism, and this is what my parents want, blah blah blah, you know.
And some people, I don't know, say that they're fine, that their routine is fine. I feel good in my routine. If I wasn't in my routine, then I would be in a worse position. But really, as we said before, that anti-masochism, you're in a worse position if you stay in that, if you don't experience pain, because it will just come back to bite you in the ass, just with that sort of idea of meaning and fulfillment.
Yeah.
How do you think people should figure out fulfillment, or what do you think is sort of the first step?
Well, I think that we need to do a lot more sort of introspection and exploring our relationships to things, and not be afraid to do that, because I think sometimes when you do a lot of deep introspective work and you like sort of survey your psychological landscape, sometimes you find things about yourself that you don't necessarily like or are counter to the image that you have of yourself, and that can be sort of dysphoric, a vexing experience. But I think it's really important. I think it's really important to study your relationships to things, and like think kind of critically about like, why am I behaving the way that I am in this situation? What trauma or like what behavior did I learn? Or like basically like why are things the way that they are? And just like kind of keep thinking about that, but also like learning to sort of unconditionally love yourself in that process, because I think that's really necessary, especially when you come up on those things like, oh, this is like a really like ugly part of me, or this is a part of me that I think is undesirable, and if like other people knew about it, then they would find me undesirable. And I think that can like kind of turn into like a really scary spiral. But I think the only way to deal with, those things and like those aspects of ourselves is to love them, essentially, and then kind of begin this like process of psychological integration.
When you talk about the ugly parts of yourself, what do you see?
About like me in particular, or just like in general?
Just you in particular, I would guess. Yeah.
Sometimes like, I don't know, I'll have feelings about things that I feel like I shouldn't be feeling, jealousy or envy, or being sort of spiteful. The parts of me that are really sort of like ego driven and like thinking about myself above others, and like being really selfish, or being really unfathomably like angry, like inappropriately angry. Like there are things that I'm angry about that I personally feel like it's like valid for me to be angry about them. Like I'm angry about racism, and I'm angry about sexism, and I'm angry about how Turkey is controlling water supplies to northeast Syria. But then there are other things that I feel like I shouldn't be angry about, like in my relationships. It's not enough for me to be like, you shouldn't feel that way for reasons X, Y, and Z. And I think it's a much more like viable solution to be like, okay, well, why are you angry about that? Why does that upset you so much? Instead of just like kind of denying it,
It's sort of acknowledging those ugly parts of yourself. Do you visually see those ugly parts of yourself? Like, do you see it as, because you are also a photographer as well, so do you ever sometimes like visualize in your mind what those look like?
No. But it's like it's a bodily feeling. So I have, when I do have feelings like that, or like sort of confront these aspects of my personality, it's like I can feel it in my chest, if that makes sense, or like different parts of my body. So and I'm a really like physical person, so I guess that makes a lot of sense. But uh yeah, it's definitely like a very bodily thing.
It's like almost like a flush through your whole body. You're just like, yeah, I'm feeling like envy. I feel like, fuck, why did that person get that promotion?
Yeah. I mean, for me, it kind of feels like a black little stone that's kind of like in my stomach, like in my chest. That's just like hanging out there. I don't really want it to be hanging out there, but it's there.
Mm. Like a gallbladder, like a little stone, like it's almost like a
Like a little
weight.
pebble.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's funny that we sort of, the ugly parts of ourselves, we always, like when someone says, I'm feeling really weighed down, or like even with Sisyphus and the boulder, like
Hmm.
that's a weight, that's a heavy, heavy weight. It's funny that we symbolize those ugly feelings with
Hmm.
how heavy something is. That there's this heavy feeling through our body or something dragging us down, literally. And I don't know, it's interesting, like we're almost being dragged down back to the earth. Like, this is too much. This is like, fuck. It's almost your body almost shutting down. Definitely acknowledging the ugly parts of yourself is super important. And I think not enough people do it because we are so sold this idea of just being like the perfect person, having the perfect Instagram, having the perfect Twitter, having the perfect career, having the perfect relationship. And the only way to get to those perfect things is by being imperfect, acknowledging the ugly, disgusting, terrible parts of yourself that you would never let anyone see. I think people need to be more aware of that, one, and two, more open about those things. And aware is super important. I think from like, especially in early childhood, I think we could do so much more about just talking about negative feelings. Like I love watching those videos about parents like explaining death to kids, or alcoholism, or like a
Hmm. Yeah.
parent's died or a grandfather's died. I think that's super important for people's development. And it's sort of sadistic saying that, like, whoa, you're gonna go up to a kid and talk about death, like you're gonna shake him about death and be like, you're gonna die, everything you love's gonna die, that pet rock you have is fucking gonna die, your favorite dog's gonna die.
Your
Like,
pet rock is gonna die.
um I feel like educators, especially in the child sector, in the early childhood sector, are afraid of kind of confronting those feelings, or they feel like it's not their place, but I think it's super important. If we have kids that are just like, I feel like that's maybe what happened to me. Like I was the happiest child, apparently. Like I was smiling my whole life. I was just giggling and laughing. And literally, I think I thought the world was like perfect almost. That when I reached high school, it sort of just all crumbled down just so quickly. And I just wasn't ready to handle it. So I think if we can interject in early childhood, or even, maybe 10, 11, 12, and just talk about negative feelings, that would be so helpful. I think one of the there was this article I read after Inside Out came out, which, by the way, I thought Inside Out was good. Like I thought it was a good film. But there was this great article that said it's okay to be sad, and we should teach kids that it's okay to be sad.
Yeah, and I feel like in like Western culture we kind of like make it out to
Mm.
be that having negative emotions and like being sad is a pathological state, but it's not. Like you literally you can't be
Yeah,
happy all the time, and it's appropriate to be sad about certain things. Like when you lose someone, you grieve, and that's
100%.
that's an appropriate response to that scenario essentially. So, and just like it's appropriate to be angry about things, like we have these feelings for a reason.
And it's funny, we only allow certain life events to make us sad. Losing a family member, or
Hmm.
losing a job, failing an exam, those common things. But we never hear about the minutiae in between that. It would be
Hmm.
socially strange to be upset in any other scenario. Like you could be upset in other scenarios over things or angry, but people are going to judge you, and it's going to be weird. Like, oh, are you crying on public transport because your boyfriend broke up with you? It's like, no, I read the news. Like, and people are like, oh, you just read the news and you're crying, and you're like, yeah, I'm crying.
Yeah.
And it's like, it's a bit strange, and we think about it, it's strange, but we need to be better in that. And I think more tolerant of our, I don't know, maybe negative emotions, and even more willing to acknowledge our negative emotions. That's why I love punk music so much, and like metal music. They actually acknowledge those things and allow that cathartic experience. Like, I think everyone should cry on fucking public transport. I think
I've done that so many times. It's for like so many reasons.
Like, and I think everyone should get angry at work once and not lose their job over it. Like, obviously there's some things that have major consequences. I'm not saying like, oh, beat up everyone at work and then everyone's gonna be like, yeah, good on you. But I'm saying, like, sort of be yourself, as long as you're not hurting anyone else or overtly hurting anyone else. Just be yourself in a sort of way that can teach you about, okay, maybe next time the photocopier doesn't work, I'm not going to freak the fuck out, And I think that's so important.
Yeah.
And I think I've been so glad, especially about people in my life. I've been so grateful to those in my life who have allowed me to sort of freak out or sort of break down. Because those breakdowns and those freakouts and those such heavy sort of emotions we were talking about, like feeling like the world is like cracking beneath your feet and you're the person creating that crack in the world because you're just so heavy. I've been so grateful for people to allow me to sort of do that. And maybe it's really unpleasant for a little bit. Like, yeah, it's going to be unpleasant. Like, no one wants to hear someone crying or screaming or yelling or being upset. But it's kind of funny because you'll know they're going to grow after that. And they'll remember that, Yeah, so we got about... I'm going to try keep these under an hour because I know I could go for 3 or 4 hours, definitely. And probably my guests are probably going to get pissed at me. But yeah, I think just sort of bring it back to full circle. If we're bringing it back to, let's say, like racism or something like that, I think it's so interesting when people, especially right-wing people or conservative people, are like, yeah, but everyone experiences racism. Why are you complaining about it? That's the thing that bothers me the most.
Oh, I hate that.
Yeah. In a sense of like, they feel uncomfortable about other people expressing their negative emotions over racism or over xenophobia. They get really uncomfortable. What do you think makes them so uncomfortable?
I mean, I don't want to like paint with a broad brush here, but I think it's a lack of emotional intelligence. And I think it's a lack of ability to say that they hurt someone, that they hurt a large group of people, that they don't want to be sort of culpable in that, because I don't think that they want to sort of damage the image that they have of themselves, either as an individual or as a group. Because if they damage that image, then that's gonna like begin to erode their ideology.
And that's so interesting because they know even if they give a little bit of a foot, they're like, oh, they have a little bit of empathy. They know that the whole thing behind them is gonna crumble. And they're so self-aware of that. So they sort of keep sparking the fire afterwards. You've seen those like videos of like, just like racist rants, and they just can't stop. You know what I mean? And it looks like they want to stop. Like they look like they want to just like leave the situation, but they're so wrong that they feel like they have to justify their wrongness. And it's just so funny to see it like happening on a person's face. It's like, they can see what they're doing is hurting another human being, but they don't want to acknowledge it.
Yeah.
And I think that kind of comes back to what we were talking about before.
I think that a large part of this problem kind of begins with the internal struggles of like the individual and and not learning to love and care for yourself, and also how that extends to learning to love and care for other people, like especially other people that you have no conceivable way of understanding.
It's so funny to me that we still nowadays still allow the excuse of like, yeah, I've never met someone like that before, so I don't know how to be around them.
Oh my God.
It's just so strange.
It's a really weird thing to say.
It's like, oh yeah, I've never been around this certain race. Like, I don't know how to act in front of them. And it's like, and then that comes down to the crux of what we're talking about. It's like, you just don't know, A, how to be a human being, and B, acknowledging that they're human beings as well.
Yeah.
And it's sort of funny in that sense. Like, I make no excuse for racism, but I can understand the sort of safety of that group mentality. And like we were talking about before, that group mentality is so comfortable. Like, have you ever been in a debate? Like, it's always better to be on the side. Let's say there's 4 people debating. It's always better to be 3-1 on the 3-1 side than the 1-3. You know, you don't want to be the person being yelled at for having the wrong opinion. So when it comes to like little communities like that where people normalize that sort of behavior, it's so comfortable to not say anything. And it's easier, you know, like, and especially since racism definitely is handed down from generation to generation, that it's so much easier not to fight with your parents for yelling out racial slurs. It's so much easier to not acknowledge it's happening or even think about it, you know, and sort of compartmentalize it. So I think it's so important to just say something, you know what I mean? It's harder, 100%, and it's probably going to get you in really terrible situations, you know, where you're going to have to confront negative emotions, but it's pretty important. And I think it's important to stand up for sort of what you believe in, but also stand up for other people. And I feel like for people like us, we definitely have that privilege to sort of stand up for other people.
I mean, I feel like that's especially important for like white people to do now, is to like stand up to other white people in particular. Like if they hear someone saying something, because obviously like it's just like when a bunch of men get in a room together, you know, the things that they might say about women are not going to be the same things that they say when there's a woman present. And just like a bunch of white people together, there may be some things said that they're not going to say in front of like a Black or brown person. There's a lot of responsibility there to like take accountability and responsibility and be like, yo, fucking stop.
Exactly. That ends it beautifully, because it's all about accountability at the end of the day, especially like things, there are a lot of things out of our control, and it might feel like the world is ending a lot of the time, and there's this, as we talked about before, this heavy feeling going through the earth or in your stomach or whatever. But it's important to sort of just be accountable for A, your own feelings, and B, for other people's feelings, because it's all relative to you, basically. You know, as much as you don't think it might matter to stand up to that person in that room, or your parent or a teacher or whoever, it's important in the long run for who you're going to be shaped to become. You know, are you really going to stand up when it's even more dire or a survival situation? You know, like if you can't even stand up to someone saying a racist comment, what are you going to do when someone is, you know, there's a racial attack, there's policy that's segregating people or hurting minorities, or, you know, what are you going to do then? So I think it's really all about accountability, and yeah, just doing your part. Definitely, I think it's super important too. Just through that negative emotion that we were talking about before, you will start doing your part, and you'll start noticing that you're doing your part, and it feels good, you know, because you're growing as a person, and that's always good. But this was fantastic. I really enjoyed it for the first episode of What Are You Thinking About? And thank you for coming on. I'm not sure when this will be out, but we will figure it out. I'll edit it and figure it out. But yeah, this was great. Do you have anything you want to plug or?
Yeah, so you can find me on Instagram at Walker Kimberly. You should check out my latest article with my colleague Kevin Nodell on Playboy.com about Blue Pfeiffer, who's a Lebanese pop star that incorporates pole dance in her performances, and she talks about the Lebanese Revolution and all that good stuff. But yeah, follow me on Twitter, K Westenhiser.
Thanks everyone for listening. Like, subscribe to the podcast, share it with your friends and family. Follow me at AdamFreedom_ on Instagram and Twitter. Adam Freedom Facebook page. You'll hear another podcast soon. And yeah, keep thinking about stuff.